Boa tarde, bom dia a todos. Nós tivemos um pequeno problema aqui para o começo dessa mesa, né, que vai ser feita pelo professor Ronald Day, que eu já vou aproveitar para apresentar. O professor Ronald Day é professor no Departamento de Biblioteconomia e Ciência da Informação, Departamento de Ciência da Informação na Universidade de Bloomington. As suas pesquisas vêm no caminho da filosofia, da história, das políticas e os aspectos culturais da informação e da documentação. Ele traz uma abordagem crítica para essas questões e hoje ele vai apresentar a conferência How Information Went Wrong and How to Get Knowledge Back Again. Thank you, Professor. It's a big pleasure to be here with you when you're ready.
Okay, I have to apologize to everyone. I thought you were an hour ahead of me. Apparently, you were 2 hours ahead of me. So if I don't know, am I late or am I early? I guess I'm late, or maybe I'm early. I don't know. It gets confusing. So what I will do is give a presentation. And I can't see anyone else out there other than Asy. I have to apologize. And then we can talk about this. The slides are very full of words. And I did that purposefully because I want you to be able to read it. If you can't understand what I say in English, at least you can read what's being said. So let me see how we're going to do this here. And I want to thank everyone for being here, whoever's out there. I can't see anyone. Asy, can you turn on your camera so at least I can see someone? It's disconcerting if all I can see is myself. Thank you. So let's go back to the first slide if we can, because it's a title. The title is, thank you. The title is actually, it was put up, my English grammar was corrected by whoever made the title in Portuguese. In English, information went bad. We say that food went bad in English, and when it doesn't taste right, and it's old. And we say that teenagers go bad. Your child goes bad. That means they become morally wrong. They do something wrong and they're headed in the wrong direction, as we say in English. So the title is purposeful, How Information Went Bad, because it got off track, and how to get knowledge back again. And so if any of you might know the first book I wrote, The Modern Invention of Information, it was about how the modern term of information was different than an older sense of information, namely to be informed of something. So this is a sense of how information went bad, starting in the 20th century, in the 90s. So since we're at a Habermas conference, we have to begin with public space. And so what I'm going to propose here is that public space, as founded in transcendental notions of freedom, equity, or equality, and justice for all, this modern notion of public space is a very fragile historical concept in lived reality. So I think we have to start with the premise that that maybe if we started 400 years ago in Europe and 500 years ago, there wouldn't have been such a notion. Instead, public space would have been totally dominated by moral psychology without these additional transcendental, if you like, moral or political notions. And I'll give you an example. When I was, and I hope you don't think this is too prejudicial, but when I was in China, maybe 5-6 years ago, I asked my stepson, who is half Chinese origin, his mother is Chinese, native Chinese, in People's Republic of China. I asked him, what is the Chinese notion of public space? And he was only 14, but he with a lot of wit, he said, there is none. Which should have told me why he was going to do well in college, because it was quite a good insight. In Chinese cultural life, it's ruled by more notions of pride, face-saving, honor, advantage. It doesn't mean that there are not notions of freedom and equality and justice. It just means that they tend to be indexed. My experience, at least, is they tend to be indexed to these other notions, these moral notions. And so I would imagine that most of our life is the same way, except we have these notions of freedom, equality, and justice that somehow are transcendental. And it's not unproblematic. We see in the United States and other countries, people fighting like crazy over these notions. And there's a reason. Well, one reason is that they're fuzzy notions. Equality to what? Freedom of what? Justice in what sense? These are not clear notions. They must have been very odd notions when introduced in the 18th century by Kant, and particularly governmental declarations, the Declaration of Independence, the Rights of Man in France. They must have been bizarre, because you had, it was a time when people lived in small communities. They didn't travel, they couldn't travel for the most part. And when they did travel, it was could be dangerous, because the people in the next town may not speak the same language. They may not have the same laws, and so on and so forth. We forget how much our lives have been shaped by 19th century media and 20th century social movements, rights of women and rights of gay rights and many other types of right movements. One corollary of this, an offshoot of this, is when people compare someone like Trump, Donald Trump, to the founders, the so-called founders of the country here. There's no comparison. The people then didn't have media. They didn't have people pressing for, they couldn't have, people couldn't press for their rights en masse. People now have that experience. So in any case, this notion of public space founded on freedom, equity, and justice for all is relatively recent in history. It's a product of specific historical, social, and cultural circumstances. It remains a set of intrinsic transcendental values for the moral orders of particularly bourgeois life, more or less so-called Western countries. And it depends, too. The moral psychology of different cultural groups and different countries mediate this, inflect it. And it's been appropriated by others in the so-called, particularly middle class. It's not the moral order of human beings naturally. We are more prone to face-saving, honor, advantage, pride, and so on and so forth. But these are transcendental values. And again, it depends on the cultural groups and the countries and so on and so forth, how much these are and how they are both lived and thought of. These can compete with moral orders and other cultural forms of morality. Now, we have to all admit that these notions of freedom, equity, justice for all, that these are transcendental values that are contradicted in practice. that they provide the bourgeois with what Friedrich Nietzsche called the metaphysical comforts of well-being, progress, and relief from guilt, that they mask to some extent a will to power, as Nietzsche pointed out, especially of capitalist interests. And they've been subverted by media and consumerism without doubt, as Habermas has shown in structural transformation of public sphere. However, to assert that they don't exist, deny the reality of our everyday life, our trust in literacy and science, and our hopes for democracy, all of which lie in trust in others and our modern institutions as leading to freedom, equity, and justice for all. So they are regulative ideals, as Kant would say, but they are also realities. Excuse me, I have a cat that wants to go out here. Go ahead. Sorry, one of the hazards of being at home. Okay, next slide. Can I get the next slide? Oh, there we go. So public space is constructed by technological mediations. And first of all, among them, that of writing and literacy. So basic literacy and writing, all these notions of freedom, equity, and justice, they depend on some sort of not only practice, but knowledge. They have to be backed with something like currency, has to be backed. So they depend both performatively and, if you like, epistemically on writing and literacy, particularly in our world. Basic literacy and writing is hardly, in the modern world, that is. Basic literacy and writing is hardly the issue, however. So if you go to public libraries in the United States, they have big posters on the wall, and they say, read. Well, reading is good, but reading is not sufficient. Literacy in the United States must be about 100% or near 100%. Yet it doesn't, that itself doesn't lead to knowledge or to equity or to freedom or to justice for all. In the 20th century, we know that even though the Nazis burned books, they also distributed propaganda. And we know that true also in China during the Cultural Revolution, and before that in the Great Leap Forward. And so they did it through writing and other sign systems. So reading is hardly the issue. The problem is critical reading, what's called by Kant critique, or has become known as in the French critique, a German critic, and a French critique. And this is a problem of understanding the logic and the system by which cultural forms and the social norms for them are produced and reproduced. In other words, for example, language and how we use language. And so this is one issue. The other issue is understanding how, and you have an older version of these slides, how knowledge is produced. And that's something I will talk about in a little bit later. And so we don't have a very good understanding. We don't always involve critical thought. And critical doesn't mean just being opposed to something. That's not critical in the sense what we're using the term here. That's not how Kant is thinking of it. That's not how, well, maybe in some instances, not how Foucault thinks about it. It's certainly not how Derrida thinks about it in deconstruction. It's a notion of understanding the logic by which a system works. So it's a form of knowledge. And again, I'll talk about knowledge processes too, which are important to understand. So the internet produces a legitimacy crisis. That's the basic thesis I'll argue here. It produces a legitimacy crisis or legitimation crisis in beliefs and trust that literacy and institutions of writing can give us a fair and just public space for all, can give us knowledge and can give us justice. Or maybe I should say knowledge as the foundation for justice and for freedom and for equality for all. And the internet has done this because information on the internet is largely separated from knowledge institutions and methods, technologies, and practices of knowledge production, as they have developed in the past from the 17th century into the current day. So from the 17th century and particularly Enlightenment onward, we have a revolution, of course, as we all know, in how modern science is done, in how institutions of not only science but scholarship are set up. Though the universities still are feudal in their administrative structure. And believe me, I'm a lower-level administrator. I can testify to the feudalism. The dean is like the king, and or the prince, and the president of the university is the king, and everyone else sort of follows. The faculty and the students are peasants out there, getting the taxes, generating the taxes. Even though it's a feudal administrative structure, it still is a knowledge-based institution to some degree. To most degrees, it sits alongside of institutions like libraries and universities and so on and so forth, and standards, government standard organizations, these things have revolutionized the world and have made our modern life possible. And so the thesis I'll be arguing, or I'm arguing here, is that they've been undermined by a notion of information that, for the most part, doesn't have much to do with knowledge. And this has produced basically a medieval worldview where all knowledge rests in sign systems on the screen. And this is why we have things like Trump and if I can say it, and I hope you're not offended, Bolsonaro. And it's a frightening situation. So can I have the next slide, please? So internet technologies and the rhetoric around them, the information age, which I addressed in the first book I wrote, broke the general requirement that individual or collective public expression had to be mediated by institutions or even by discourse, which knowledgeable others in order to be worthy of publication, that is being made public. So we have in the word publication, public, right? So the notion of knowledge in the modernity has been to make things public. You have to, in terms of knowledge, to make knowledge public, or to make something into knowledge in the public. That's a better way of saying it. It requires institutional mediation. It's not people just sitting around coffee shops and stuff. It's these institutions. And we have to remember that these institutions are important because without them, we don't have modern knowledge. We can have personal knowledge, in other words, what I've experienced or I think is true, my opinion, in other words, or my beliefs, or my experience, but it's not public knowledge, in public sense of knowledge. And so this is something we have to remember, and I think we've forgotten, and certainly people don't quite understand what these institutions are doing and why they're there and why they're so important. Instead, they have come to the belief that anything they say is equivalent. On the internet, the value that determines whether something should be published or not is self-determined interest. In other words, if I think it should be out there, then I can put it out there into the public, as it were. And whether it can be seen by a search, can be seen by other people, depends on the search engine. And for a great extent, actually, or a ranking system like Google News or something like that, aggregator. And so the value as to whether it should be ranked high enough or indexed is a problem with the search engine and how the search engines are designed, and also algorithms and social media. And for the most part, these things are designed as popularity algorithms. And so if we look at Google search, it's the ranking system that comes back from when you look for documents on Google. It's mediated by what's called PageRank. And I mean, there's other types of functions going on in the algorithms, but PageRank was the important thing about Google search and search and retrieval. And PageRank it has different origins, but one origin is citation indexing. And it's Eugene Garfield's what was called Web of Science. I think it's called now is it called Web of Science, or they changed the name when it got sold several times. They changed the name. I'm sorry, Science Citation Index. That was the original term. So Eugene Garfield's Science Citation Index, I think it's called Web of Science now, was one of the influences on Google PageRank. But the difference is that what Web of Science indexes is already peer-reviewed material. What Google, in other words, it constitutes a form of knowledge. It's peer-reviewed by knowledge institution professionals, university professors and librarians and so on and so forth. Google doesn't use that source material for what constitutes their search results. It's all the documents that Google searches or indexes, and that could be any document in the world. So Google is not designed as a knowledge system. It's designed off of a knowledge system, or it was influenced by a knowledge system, but it's not designed as a knowledge system. It's an information system. So what people usually find and look for in the internet and post are things of taste, not knowledge. So what I like and what I don't like. And you have that in like in Facebook, right? You like something and you don't like it. And that liking something can raise the value of that document and so on and so forth. And if you get on Google and you search something and you keep searching the same type of thing, you get advertisements come up. And the search engine can also act as a recommendation system for yourself or for others. First is personalized search, what's called personalized search. And so on and so forth. So the criteria is liking something. Now, it's not that knowledge systems don't have liking things, but it's based on expert liking. So it's based on hopefully knowledge, not just taste, or it's expert taste, which should be have a sense of knowledge involved. That's why people get jobs in knowledge institutions, hopefully. So this difference is important between knowledge institutions and information age technologies. They're different. And next slide, please. Next one. There we go. Knowledge institutions are at the heart of the progress of modernity. trusted records and trusted processes of knowledge, and modern science being able to willing to revise even basic ontology if the evidence shows otherwise. So modern science is characterized not by truth, as it were, but by the willingness. I mean, there were truths before modern science, but the willingness to revise basic ontologies and not tie them to totally, at least, transcendental systems. In other words, God, and this is how the universe is, or this is what Aristotle said, etc. If the object in front of you that you call a cat says, in English at least, woof, 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 it tells you, I'm not a cat, I'm a dog. And you have to revise your mental model or your ontology to say this entity is a dog. So what distinguishes, at least in the natural sciences, particularly natural sciences, I should say, modern science is the ability to objects to push back, to say, no, I'm not this. I have these properties, and you better explain them. So because your science system is wrong. And truth doesn't lie in the science system alone, and that distinguishes modern empirical science. We also need to trust the records, to trust the process. I mean, we just described one process of empirical science, and so knowledge in natural sciences, but also trusted records are important. We have to be able to know what other people said, and with some trust, we have to know that the institutions keep the records well. We have to know that that the flood records from last year accurately show floods, and so on and so forth. And so our lives really depend upon trusted records, trusted processes of knowledge, etc. Just to drive down the road, just to go down the road, we rely upon standards of engineering, standards of building, standards that go into the cars, government standards to make the cars safe or safer. Our lives are just, modern life is just filled with standards and information infrastructures that are not always seen. So this is one of the contradictions that we see now, that people don't believe these things, but yet they live their lives. They don't believe knowledge institutions. They don't believe climate science. They don't believe all this, but they live their lives based on it. It doesn't make any sense. So how do we explain this? Well, we'll try to explain it later. Such institutions function not by faith, but by trust, both within specialties and when presented to the lay public. As Bruno Latour has noted, what is noteworthy with climate change denialism is not just distrust in the findings of climate science, but the distrust of modern science. This is extremely important insight in what's translated into English as an inquiry into modes of existence. Latour tells the story of being in a meeting with a climate scientist and an oil executive or something like this. And the executive says, why should we believe you about climate science? Why should we believe there is human-caused change of the climate? And Latour says, instead of answering the man by saying, well, here is the data, here is the scientific findings, the climate scientist turns to him and says, well, why should you believe in science? That's the important point. Latour talks about it elsewhere. You can find it on the internet, see him talk about it as it were live, even though it was 20 years ago. And this is an extremely important point. Because what we see with people like Trump and I hope you don't mind saying this, but Bolsonaro and others of this type is a denial of science, the institution of science, not just the facts, but the institution, even while they live in a modern world based on it. It's extraordinary. So this is very important, because if we don't have this, it's not faith, it's trust. It's trust, earned trust. We have people live beyond age 39 and 40, where a century ago they didn't. So on and so forth. And we drive down roads safely. And we take off in planes, and most of the time the planes don't crash. These are miracles. And this is what these people deny, that these are possible. When they say, well, you're not going to die of COVID, or it's not a pandemic. It's not a pandemic, or it's nothing to worry about. Health officials tell us it is something to worry about. We should listen. Doesn't mean we will die, but we should listen. So that's, otherwise, what kind of world are we living in? We're living in a medieval world. So, and we've seen medieval worlds in the modern world. In other words, worlds that are just semiological, are made up of just science systems, or largely of science systems. Truth is a series of signs and its relation to other signs. And these tend to be things like fascism, that are highly aesthetic, they're sign systems based on prejudices and beliefs. So the concept of information has displaced modern knowledge institutions and their products and values, and has been embraced by such institutions as well. It has led to political disaster. This has led to the political disaster we are in the midst of. Has resulted in confusions in public space as to what is not knowable and what is simply a matter of faith and taste. The difference between public knowledge and personal knowledge has undermined values of freedom, equality, and justice for all, insofar as knowledge can help achieve and secure these. That's what I argue. So next slide, please. So the modern concept of information, or the modern invention, as I said in the first book, developed in the 20th century, particularly at its end, had several epistemic and rhetorical and aesthetic characteristics. First, information is viewed as referring to physical or ideational substances that represent the world. Paul Atlay's work is probably the paradigm of this. If you remember Paul Atlay, the founder of European documentation, that's how he's talked about, and the predecessor of information science, as some people claim. So information is viewed as referring to physical ideational substances that represent the world. Paul Atlay's work is probably the paradigm of this, where knowledge, or what's called information, is seen to reside in content in generalized books called documents. Information library science largely continues this tradition as practice and theory. In other words, people believe that knowledge, and if you like, truth, reside in the content or the representations of books. And now we call this, and the prejudice is that this is what information does. It gives us the content, represents the world, is for Atlay the facts of the world. It pictures it. It's a picture theory of truth. And I've written about that elsewhere. This is a real problem. Let me give you a concrete example. You go to the doctor, something is wrong, obviously. Something is wrong. You go to the doctor, and the doctor says you have this or that. you have, I don't know, pancreatic cancer, or you have a worst case, or you have this disease, or you have a bad hip, you have a hip arthritis. Let's take an easier example than pancreatic cancer. You have hip arthritis. And people think that's a final, right? Oh, I have hip arthritis. So the question is, what do I do? Well, the problem is that what the doctor is telling you there, he's telling you that these series of symptoms and this reading of the symptoms by expert opinion, expert knowledge, suggest a disease called hip arthritis. And for that disease, there's a series of institutional acts you can take that involve insurance companies, that involve surgeries, maybe they involve physical therapists, and so on and so forth. But that's what they're telling you. It doesn't tell you you have, it's a judgment that is based on the best available science. You have to read it that way. You have to read it as you don't have hip arthritis. What you have is an institutional judgment based on these symptoms. And so the diagnosis may be correct or incorrect, more or less correct or incorrect to what to what the outcome may be if you treat it that way. So does that mean that what they're telling you is not true? Well, it depends how you discuss truth, what you mean by truth. What it means is it's true according to those institutions and activities and so on and so forth. Now, people don't like hearing that. It sounds like the doctor doesn't know what they're saying. Well, the doctor does know what he or she is saying, but you have to understand that there's variability. You may not have hip arthritis. In other words, if you get treated in a certain way, it may not cure it. And actually, if you go into the case of hip arthritis, because I was diagnosed with hip arthritis, I went into it quite a bit. There's very bad evidence that there's a lot of evidence, actually, it's not bad, but there's a lot of evidence that the correlation between pain and what's diagnosed as hip arthritis is very poor. So in other words, between the standard for diagnosing hip arthritis, which might be X-ray. So the correlation between pain and X-ray is very, very poor. It's about 28%. So there remains a big problem. What is hip arthritis? How do you diagnose it? How do you treat it? What it comes down to is they tell people that they have hip arthritis and they give them an operation. And most of those people, not all, feel better. And so they say, well, you had hip arthritis. So the proof for hip arthritis is a major operation, but it doesn't always work. So you have to realize in all these things that there's the representation is not a representation of some absolute truth. Science doesn't give you some absolute truth. What it gives you is a set of terms and a set of operations that give you an explanation. And the explanation can be challenged. It has to be able to be challenged. But you have to have evidence. And you can't just give opinion. And so skepticism is built into science. Cynicism is not. And that's the problem we have, is that people are cynical. And the question is why? And how do information systems like the internet, public information systems, have they, as it were, encourage this cynicism? Well, my explanation, what I'm giving you here, is that the explanation of what science does is not well understood. People don't understand how science operates. They think it gives them truths. Transcendental truths. And then when those truths are not true, then the experts are idiots. It's like my saying, well, my hip is the same as it was 7 years ago. So if I had arthritis, it would have certainly developed enough by now that I couldn't walk at all. And so the doctors who told me that I had hip arthritis are a bunch of idiots. Well, I wouldn't go that far. I would say that maybe they weren't right, weren't correct. But that's the problem of the science of medicine. It's not really an issue of them alone. And it's not saying that science is a bunch of idiots or completely wrong. It's saying that there's still something to be learned in that science, maybe, particularly as it applies to me, which is always where it's important. So the information age also claims to replace documentary institutions such as libraries, archives, and museums. So the notion of information age in the 90s was, these are nice places, but we deliver information everywhere. We have information to everyone. And so, these places like libraries, archives, and museums, they're cumbersome. They have these information infrastructures like classifications and subject headings, which are hard to understand. And so the internet's much better. You can get it much more easily. And so the warrant by which information becomes equivalent to or supplants knowledge processes in the institutions is efficiency. So I can get the information quicker on the internet. I can get more quickly on the internet, rather. I don't have all these awkward information structures. And it's free, or it seems free. It seems free both in the sense that there are no classification structures, et cetera, standing in my way. It's free because it doesn't cost any money. It's free because other people can offer me the same answers, different answers to my questions. The problem, and they used to say, information wants to be free. Information doesn't want anything. It's not an intentional being. And knowledge algorithms are not free. They're mediating one's relationship to documents. And documents are not free. Someone's putting them up, and they're putting them up for some reason. So the notion that information on the internet has supplanted knowledge institutions is not warranted. But that's been a hard sell, because information tends to be more valuable for someone if it's within easy reach. They used to say in the days of paper that if a book was within 6 feet or 3 feet of you, just on my desk, then it was about 50% more likely to be used than if it was 6 feet away. And this is the same principle. So efficiency and ease of access, ease of use, become the way we value information, and information as knowledge too. So this is a problem. Next slide, please. Efficiency and access was a goal for also Melville Dewey in the first library school. The first library school was called the School of Library Economy. Economy meant the quick and easy access to books and other documentary materials, and it became the goal of libraries. In the post-war period, information science developed as the efficient retrieval of information. Information first meant physical documents retrieval, and then later the content of documents. In other words, their ideas, as it were. So the notion was in user studies and so on and so forth, increasingly through the 60s and 70s, et cetera, that what you were retrieving was not the documents. That wasn't what was important, but the content of the documents. And so it didn't matter the form. And then when you designed retrieval systems, what was important was that you retrieve what the documents were about. And so that could be actually represented in, according to this kind of epistemology, in metadata. And so you didn't really need the documents either. You just needed an abstract or even the formal metadata, the indexing terms. So you have a and what this aboutness of a document, the abstract or the metadata did was it corresponded to the needs of users. So the idea was you had a person, and that person was called a user, and they had a need, and they usually pointed to the head for some reason as the place for the need, as the mind is said to exist in the head for these people. And so the need was up there, and so someone typed something into a search, and that was the need, and then the information system went and found something that corresponded to it. Now, in information science, as we know, user-assigned search terms and algorithmic retrieval came to supplant knowledge organization systems such as classifications and authorized index and thesauri vocabulary. Traditional authoritative mediation was replaced by statistically driven indexing and search. So the system seemed more transparent. It seemed more to correspond to the user's needs, as it were. So users and their needs became seen as driving the searching and choosing of documents, rather than the institutions and their classification and metadata schemes and their collections driving the satisfaction of user needs. And so we had the language that the human librarians and libraries are supposedly supplanted and are less by systems that are less intrusive and controlling, and also by the entire universe of knowledge rather than curated collections. So this was sort of the ideology of the internet in the 1990s, and it's kind of sort of has become the norm now. The algorithmic, now to make it even more seductive, the algorithmic logic that this statistical retrieval has followed is largely that of popularity-based indexing and retrieval via link analysis and graph algorithms. And so it seems that the internet just has common sense to it. It just functions according to how knowledge should work. Information retrieval should work. And so this is how the whole epistemology is sort of set up. Can I have the next slide? Now we'll take a look at the components of these systems, and we have to look at these systems as socio-cultural and technical devices. And so information in the internet appears because of social, cultural, and technical affordance working together. So if we analyze these technologies, we always have to think of them in each of these terms. Cultural, which is the language. Social, the way in which the language is used. I'm just using language. It could be visual language too. And then the technical mediation, how the language is delivered and organized and so on and so forth. So next slide. Thank you. So the modern sense of information, the information age, is, as we talked about with Otley, is that a fact or potential fact? This doesn't have to just do with Otley. It has to do with our lives as literate people. living in cultures that are defined by literacy. We have thousands of years where we assume, if it's in writing, that if it is not true, then it must be potentially true. And that's because we, for thousands of years, documents, whether they're in modern science or pre-modern science or so on and so forth, were published, made public authoritatively. Right? The king allowed something to be published. The church allowed something to be published, and it conformed to those knowledge systems. Ordinary people couldn't publish. They couldn't read. They couldn't write. So we have sort of a prejudice that if it's in writing, that it's probably more true. We have the prejudice, too, that if people can read and write, that they're less ignorant. I'm not sure that's true. Having met people who can't read and write, it's sometimes shocking how ignorant people are when they can read and write. In fact, they're more ignorant sometimes for reasons we'll talk about. So in reality, most information search and retrieval systems, as I said, do not involve fact, issues of institutional fact, at least. They are knowledge. They involve taste, what other people like, and so on and so forth. Information systems may or may not be associated with techniques, methods, and institutions of knowledge. The internet isn't, for the most part. Most people also have low interest or understanding how information retrieval engines or social media algorithms function. And again, because the functions seem to be that they correspond to how I say things and so on and so forth. They just seem like common sense. They seem like the truth. And that's not actually how things work here. Search engines do mediate knowledge, and they mediate in a way, for example, popularity. Personalized search has resulted in information silos, whereby one's own opinion is multiplied by many others that are alike, resulting in me having more confidence in my opinion as representing fact. This has also led to more extreme expressions being expressed in public. So everyone seems like me, so I can say it even more strongly. And one of the things the internet has shown us, the social media at least has shown us, is how extreme people can be in writing, where they would never be face-to-face, I'm sure. Or their extremity in writing is then taken into the streets in face-to-face encounters. Writing, we never thought of this really before, but writing is quite prejudicial. The type of writing we're talking about, which is a monologic type of writing. In other words, where it's a statement. That's what we mean most of the time by writing, that I'm stating things and no one else is, or I'm stating things on behalf of other people. The statement form of knowledge, which takes also this notion of fact, like in how Lay speaks about it, is a real problem. It allows the most extreme views to be expressed. And that's most of our rhetorical tradition. There's a lot of elements of the rhetorical nature of writing, which are now coming to light, which never came to light before, but also tell us about the past. So if, you had a colonial, as Asy and I have written about, if you have a colonial situation where the people are reporting, the Portuguese explorers are reporting back to the king or back to the church, or particularly if it's a moral situation, they're reporting on the natives. They can say pretty extreme things without the natives interjecting. And particularly if the writing is then separated by several thousands of miles in several months and years. There's no natural science really possible between the Portugal and Brazil in the short term, right? The natives can't push back against their depiction. very easily if the management of the depiction and the truth value of it is being done in Portugal. What Latour would call the center of calculation, centre de calcul, center of measurement. So there's a lot of things the contemporary internet can tell us about writing, and it's not all favorable. It's a lot of unfavorable. And again, this makes us have to rethink the problem of literacy and the privilege we give to literacy and civilization, as it were. So also, paradoxically, such extremes in the internet that we see in social media, for example, have happened too, and outside of it, as a result of the, social media, for example, have happened too, simply because we have so much information. We have so many different viewpoints from around the world. When community, when it does form in the internet, it tends to form around highly generalized and hardened views in politicized spaces. Next slide. The internet has also become heavily remediated during the past 15 years or so by old media and its portals. The internet that appeared in the 90s is very different from the internet now. News is simply that which purports to be new. It's not necessarily journalism. The more efficient news is in conveying its message, the more extreme its message, then the greater it's valued in the attention economy. The marketplace of ideas notion of free speech works against us here because the loudest and simplest message wins. And you'll see me talk about this notion of the marketplace of ideas, again, in relation to so-called free speech. Information retrieval design continues to rely on rational choice theory. It sees the user as a free agent of choice, driving algorithms and collections to adapt to his or her needs. What I argue, though, in my contrary view, is that, however, it's collections, indexes, and search engines that drive our needs as our needs, not users. In other words, we're created, it's just like libraries, we're created in our needs by what's available. And what I will argue in another slide or two is what's available to us is largely prejudices. It's past language, and the past language that's given priority to is the most popular past language. So I reverse the usual trajectory of user studies from user to collections. I reverse that and say collections to users. And then underlying both collections and users are ideological assumptions, constellations, I call them. Indexes and collections, including the internet and collections of documents as created and ranked by searches, are historically backward-facing, as Michael Buckland has told us. This is an extremely important idea, or insight. Indexes and collections tell us what was said, not what can be said. But by being constantly mediated by these indexes, we are actually putting ourselves in the past, sometimes without even looking outside the door. And this has great consequences, this foreshadowing of the present and future by the past constantly. And we should really rethink this. Again, this is a consequence of our being literate people, but now our literacy is all the time. We're constantly on these devices. And so the checks and balances that used to be between writing and our observation of writing in the world, how much it, you read a novel and you say, how much does the world look like this novel? And it's as if we completely live in these novels now. That's not good. So, or it's a problem. So next slide. So let's turn to technical aspects of the internet technologies. Internet technologies are driven by indexing and search algorithms, particularly today those following link analysis. systems and algebraic graph theory, showing relations between entities based on various types of likenesses, analytic relations between categories, geography, time of search, previous searches, etc. The relations are ranked to present us as predictions and other manners, as well as designed to help guide the user in choice of further searches. The fundamental problem of information, or fundamental, I should say, function of document retrieval remains, though, whether it's older documentary systems or newer algorithmic one, that's connecting users with documents. And the systems do this through matching the user's expressed needs to information and collections. Search engines attempt to co-position or co-index users and documents together. In my book, Indexing It All, explains and explores this. This indexing may then feed further searches. What generally isn't accounted for, though, are the common universes, the common logi of ideas. In other words, the ideologies by which this is possible. I call these universes constellations. Such can be found in I think, Indexing It All, in my book, Documentarity, I call it constellations. Such can be found in the cultural forms, such as vocabulary and the social norms for its use, by which both user needs and documentary content achieve meaning. Just like in a library collection, users articulate their needs in terms that the collection and its representations can understand. So, for example, if we want to search the term hot dog to refer to a hot dog, right, a panting dog, a panting canine, or a summer's day, then we have to work against PageRank in Google search, because the popular vote for algorithm used in Google search privileges hot dog in the sense of a Frankfurter as a food item, not a dog. So the popularity ranking forces us into assuming the hot dog refers to a food item and not a panting dog. So we can see the popularity ranking, the construction of meaning for a term in that simple example. So let's go to the next slide. Push ahead. And this is simply a picture of information retrieval system in the center with what I've been explaining depicted. So outside of the information retrieval system, I don't know where I got this picture, it's somewhere. You have cultural forms and social norms for expression that make up constellations of concepts or ideas in their rational arrangement. In other words, ideology, which are prejudgments, give us prejudgments. And these help form our personal psychology, our toolboxes in which we live or we do search. Next slide. Now, some political aspects. For those of us old enough to remember, the documentary world before the internet was very different than today, today's world. The availability of text before and after the internet can't compare, but the ideology of information and its age in society as a disruptive force to not just print, but to formally print-based knowledge institutions has developed alongside of economic disruptions brought about by neoliberalism during the same period. So the information age and its rhetoric grew up together with neoliberalism. Not only do we have more people than ever reading and communicating across vast global and national distances, but we're continuously being occupied with our digital devices, which act as an attention economy made up of largely semiological determined facts and truth. Most of our truths on the internet are semiological. They're determined by reference to other signs. Empirical verification tends to be lacking. And together with a skepticism regarding institutions and government knowledge institutions, that, for example, universities that have been advanced because of neoliberalism, this has led to more confusion, not less, about knowledge, about what could be considered true and not true. Next slide. Generally, we are not educated how knowledge develops, how it historically develops, how it differs from information more generally, how to access different types of truth claims, peer review, expertise, and other mechanisms of science. As I told you, people look for cures where there are only medical processes. They look in books for knowledge rather than processes of knowledge, institutions as sources of knowledge. And they misunderstand the characteristic and institutional context of knowledge and fact. They think of fact as being transcendental substances rather than claims. Another aspect, which is a problem with the internet, is freedom of speech, understood according to the classic English liberalism of J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, that is, a speech in the marketplace of ideas. This fails to account for mass media. It fails to really account for hate speech, speech that attempts to shut other people down for the sheer reason of shutting them down, and not for it doesn't want them to contribute to marketplace of ideas. So in the past, in the United States, they have regulated this better through licensing laws, but in the past 20 years or so, they've let this go. And so we have what we call talk radio, and Facebook and Twitter publishing all sorts of purposely falsified information. I think this has to get under control. I'm not a fan of the, as it were, the free speech laws in this country. The marketplace of ideas doesn't exist as it existed in the 18th century, as Habermas has shown. Next slide. The historical analogy of the working class turning to the right because it can't move to the left under conditions of internationalism and what we now neoliberalism and increasing poverty and desperation. We've seen, and doing so through the knowledge or information of alternative media. We've seen this before. And for example, in Nazi Germany, which was Weimar Republic was an international state, and because of the Great Depression, because of war debt and so on and so forth, and because it was unable, the suppression of the international left, people turned to the right, and they turned to the right with the help of radio, cinema, alternative newspapers, etc. This has happened before. Next slide. I think the last slide. Next slide, please. Should be one more. Asy, can you help?
Yeah, I'll talk to Ricardo. Just a minute.
Okay, thank you. That's the last. This is the last one. So what can be done? Well, here are a few ideas. Information literacy, fact-checking reliable sources, journalism, knowledge institution sources, knowledge authority, so on and so forth. We know this. But what we also need to go beyond information literacy and educate people about knowledge processes, procedures, and science. What science can do and what it can't. Earlier I referenced but didn't talk about the 6th chapter of Latour's book, Science in Action. And it has a very important concept of information that's not really well talked about in information science. Libraries, particularly non-public ones, need to promote themselves as parts of knowledge processes alongside of laboratories, field work, use and reuse. Knowledge doesn't reside in books, libraries, or books, but rather these are part of knowledge processes. This is what Latour argues. I think he's right. In books and other documentary forms are points at which stabilization of information by texts and records occur, and so in total constitute knowledge and knowledge processes. This is important. Libraries have to get away from the old picture that knowledge resides in their stacks. No, it doesn't. They are part of knowledge institutions. They are centers de calcul, as Latour says, they're data, which translates colloquially as data centers. And that's how they have to be seen, and they aren't seen within the bibliographic tradition. We also need to distinguish between different types of libraries and documentation centers in terms of their relation to knowledge as knowledge institutions. Public libraries, obviously, are not totally involved in this. They're involved in popular knowledge and information, more colloquially, or more technically, as we've talked about. So we have to make a distinction between different types of knowledge. The library tradition has actually made different types of libraries, archives, museums, etc. We need to see information, internet, and text as a problem of empirical application in science, when possible, empirical verification. Information comes from a lived world, and it needs to be dragged back to it. Free speech laws need to be revised, as I said. The marketplace of ideas notion is just, it's antiquated. It doesn't work. The public needs to understand what is at stake. The last point is the public needs to understand what is at stake in being cynical towards modern knowledge institutions. Skepticism towards knowledge and knowledge institutions processes is not the same as cynicism. To not trust modern science and modern medicine, but to live a life, a modern life, dependent upon these is a contradiction. And it reduces the public sphere to a joke, really. And that's what we have now. We have a bunch of jokers that are running the world and making us look like clowns. So there's the solution. I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. It was great to hear. Just a minute. Galera, nós vamos agora abrir para a sessão de perguntas. Eu vi que nós já temos uma pergunta da Verônica Scartazini. Eu vou trabalhar da seguinte forma. Vou pedir para o Ricardo botar a pergunta grande aqui na tela, tá? Então, se puderem, podem enviar pelo chat que nós vamos colocar aqui na tela. Professor, Veronica asked you a question. Just a question.
Yes, please. Hello, Veronica. How are you? Should I read it?
Okay.
Information, Professor Veronica asks, information is essential for democracy. From that, and what are the contributions of information science as a political field to face the waves of dissemination of fake news? Well, information can be essential for democracy. It can be detrimental to democracy, as I've suggested in the talk. Knowledge is essential for democracy, I would think. Since information is not knowledge, as I've argued, it's more general than knowledge. It's not necessary for democracy. You need knowledge. Information can actually be detrimental. If we take information as simply that which informs us, well, we're informed by all sorts of things. We're informed by religious beliefs. We're informed by superstitions. We're informed by what I personally know. These are not bad things, and they can become problems of knowledge in a more public sense. But we have to at least bring it into more of a public sphere and maybe institutional processes. I think using it, is information necessary for democracy? It's an interesting problem if it is. I mean, what do we mean by information? That's what I'm pressing on, and that comes from the first book, The Modern Invention of Information. If we mean that information, in other words, is sets of truths that are not subject to processes of institutional verification are necessary for democracy, then what's the difference between saying, well, opinion is necessary for democracy? we could say we have many different opinions, or make up democracy. In fact, that's a notion. That's the notion of the marketplace of ideas, the John Stuart Mill notion. When John Stuart Mill proposed, in his book on liberty, proposed this notion of free speech as the basis for democracy, what he was doing it was as a parliamentarian, a white, obviously white, male parliamentarian among other parliamentarians. It was already compromised from the get-go. This notion, the notion of a public, it didn't include women, it didn't include the common people, it didn't include they were representatives of the common people maybe, but it didn't necessarily include them. And the mass media as we know it doesn't really arise until the early 19th century. So it was still pretty new on the horizon, and it was still in its infancy. And once you get into the 20th century, as Habermas argues, the mass media has infiltrated all notions of popular voice, as it were. And what we are is mostly a collection of, we become users of taste, constructed as what Adorno and Horkheimer call it, the culture industry. And now the internet, language of the internet has said, the Information Society said in the early 20th century, cultural studies of digital culture said, well, we're all done with that. We don't have these mass media anymore. And now we are all left to be, or as the leftists are reading, was singularities. We're all left to be these expressive and achieving singularities. However, what we see with the election of Trump and Bolsonaro is we aren't. We are still being undermined by our ideologies, by our tastes, and they're being formed by these larger cultural industries as well as our traditions. If we say that democracy is there's different ways of saying it. Information leads to democracy. If we mean by that opinion, then we have to ask, well, how is opinion shaped by by culture industries? And if we don't like the notion of culture industries still existing, then we can say, well, how does it get formed by past uses of language? And particular types of language, and the ranking of that language in terms of popularity. And then we're led back to the concept of prejudgments and prejudice and ideologies. And these are not necessarily, when I use these terms, it's not necessarily a negative sense of them. It's ideology in its more neutral sense is simply a constellation of ideas. In other words, a constellation. And what is an idea? Well, idea is a cultural form, a word tied to actions, and other actions, other cultural forms and actions. So, in other words, we have a constellation. We have universes of these that we deploy, and these constitute our prejudgments, our prejudices, and in the negative sense. And this is what's privileged and deployed on the internet. So if that's what makes up democracy, then democracy is actually made up by a series of prejudices. The whole purpose of science and modern institutions is to undo that. You can believe what you want. You can have whatever prejudices you want. Aristotle could say what he wanted to say, but the universe doesn't necessarily operate that way. And that's what these institutions and technologies and tools of knowledge tell you. And that's what's being ignored today. We have a lot of information. We have a lot of opinion. But what we don't have is a lot of knowledge. I mean, in the public realm, we have a lot of taste. But, that doesn't necessarily give us a better as it were, democracy. Democracy should be informed decision, should be informed not in the sense of simply opinion, but informed in the sense of knowledge. We need experts. We need people who have some knowledge. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be skeptical of them, but cynical is another issue. Cynicism doesn't get us anywhere. That's what we've kind of learned. And being a very cynical person myself, it's been quite a lesson for myself. And being someone who life has depended on literacy and books, it's been a lesson on the negativities, the negative characteristics of books and literacy. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Professor. We have another 2 questions. One is from Blazer Lima. Professor, under Habermas studies and books, what can we point out about the nowadays society?
Well, I'm not a Habermasian. I don't really know much about Habermas other than the structural transformation book. And that I'm not sure how well I've read. But I mean, it's kind of, a lot of it's kind of known by now in the popular sphere, or in a more popular academic sphere. So I shouldn't say, but as a non-Habermasian, as someone who doesn't know Habermas's work well, I think one of the things we can say without a doubt is that there's a real problem with legitimacy claims. The different criteria by which knowledge on the internet is said to be true. For example, let's use an easy example. If I want to search something on the internet, maybe I should ask myself, first of all, what type of user am I? Am I a user looking for knowledge? Am I a user looking for opinion? Am I a user looking for consumer choices? I mean, we could break it down to different types of episteme that Plato gives, opinion and knowledge and so on and so forth. What type of user am I? And so that leads to the information literacy question of what type of sites am I going to search in? If I want knowledge sites, maybe I should go to an EDU site, or used to be, maybe still is, government site, and or at least a legitimate government site, which under Trump has become hard to find on the internet. At least it does exist, but the Trumpians have falsified the portals of these government sites. Or where should I go? So the different types of material will be subject to different types of truth claims, and the truth claims can be legitimated in different ways. The different types of knowledge and different types of knowledge take different types of mechanisms for truth. I mean, Latour has talked about this too in regard to matters of concern and matters of fact. They have different procedures of verification. So that would be one answer. Another answer would be, of course, the notion of public space, and how do we discuss public space in a internet world. And some people, as you know, probably know, have asked that we are asking that we look again at the Frankfurt School for clues about this. Because the Frankfurt School, as you might know, was sort of thrown away in the rush to see the internet as a source of singularities and struggling subjectivities and so on and so forth, sort of by the Negrian, Deleuzian readers of the early 2000s. And that hasn't quite come to pass. Instead, when I wrote Indexing It All, my second monograph, it had a very pessimistic view. It had a view that basically we were constructed through these information systems like I've presented here. And I thought, well, everyone at that time was saying, no, the internet's completely new. And I thought, well, I must have made a real mistake here. I must be holding on to an old notion of the internet as ideology and old documentation systems instead of seeing the promise and possibility of the new ones. And then Trump was elected with the help of these systems. And I thought, well, maybe I wasn't so wrong. Maybe my pessimism, my usual pessimism, has actually been justified again. And see, that's what happens. If you're pessimistic enough, eventually it comes true. But you have to be an optimistic pessimist in life. At least if you come from the New York City area that I come from originally. It sort of comes part of your blood to be an optimistic pessimist. So this is, that's enough said on that. So I don't know. The public space issue in Habermas has to, of course, be looked at again. And then maybe Latour argued that we need to go beyond critique. I think that needs to be thought of. How critique, what is critique? We have a real problem of not only going beyond critique, but just dealing with critique now, because critique when I came up meant something very different than now critical. Critical has become, I don't like. That's not what critique means. And that's become an issue in this country in many ways. Critical librarianship has developed, as you know. There's a field now called critical librarianship, which I guess helped found in some ways. But sometimes the notions of critique in it is just, it's foreign to me. It's based on I am this and you are that. And the whole notion of critique as it came out of deconstruction and so forth was looking at I and you is the problem of I and you. The relationship there is a problem of a system of knowledge, of a system of opposition, of a system of identities, formations that underlie both the possible of what I think I am and I claim you are. It's looking at the logic, or what Hegel called the system of logic, by which differences are understood as difference, not as what Derrida called difference. And this is a huge difference between Kant's notion of critique, what the French tradition took up as critique, Derrida took up as deconstruction and difference, and what is now called difference and critical. There's it's strange to at least to see myself as the grandfather of a family I'm not sure I recognize everyone in. So that's a personal note, but maybe that's a bad historical reading.
Thank you, Professor. We have now a question from Andrea Carriquiri. Just ask you for a few minutes. Gente, eu vou poder receber aqui mais uma pergunta, por causa do tempo mesmo, para que a gente não ultrapasse, né? Como a professora Márcia comentou, a gente vai ter uma mesa agora às 2 horas. Peço para que vocês, sei que o almoço vai ser encurtado, mas para que vocês voltem, né? É importante essa rodada de comunicação para que a gente continue o debate. Thank you, Professor Ron. I was just saying about the time. Okay.
This is most people will disagree with me. I'm not. The notion of free speech in this country, popularly and I guess legally, I'm told, is that the notion is that the best speech wins. That's John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. It's English liberalist tradition. And it says that if everyone speaks, then the best speech wins. And that's nonsense. The loudest voice often wins. The people who have the biggest prejudice wins, because that's what everyone believes. And the media is involved up to its nose in most of these things, and at least written and mediatized, what we see on the internet, directly or indirectly. So the conditions for this market, what's called marketplace of ideas, never existed in the first place. There never really was a true free market, just like there isn't a true free market in the economic sector. Another problem, it's just no good from the beginning. The other problem I have is what's called hate speech. In other words, where people speak, and they speak or write. What we mean by speech is writing. And the problem is bigger in writing, as I said. People become more extreme in writing. And the problem, when people are trying to purposely close down other people, when they're purposely trying to tell other people that they should shut up, and they do it by ad hominem attacks upon the person, when they do it for the purpose of closing that other person down, that's not contributing to the marketplace of ideas. Now, someone might say, in arguing against that, they say, well, aren't you closing down someone for the purposes, aren't you purposely closing them down if they're saying something negative? So aren't you contradicting yourself? And the reply I have is no, because the intentionality they're showing is that of not closing another, not telling another person to, or not using power, as it were, whatever the power is, a university, botany, or whatever, to tell someone, look, you don't have a right to speak. Not for the purpose of their stopping their contribution, but for the purpose of stopping another person's contribution. So you have to look at whether there's a negative intentionality or positive intentionality to speech. And people who are engaged, to me, who are engaged in hate speech, in other words, who are trying to destroy other people for the sheer purpose of controlling their positive contribution, I don't see that as a positive contribution to the marketplace of ideas. And I think that at that point, whether it be a university or, as in this country it did happen through licensing laws of the airwaves, that the government steps in. Now, there's all sorts of fears that, well, this will lead to totalitarianism, et cetera, et cetera. I think the other question is, how does not doing that lead to totalitarianism? How does that not lead to a negative environment? So I'll give you an example. At the universities here, we aren't allowed to, we have to say all speech is equal and blah, 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 blah. Well, all speech isn't equal. It's not equal from the beginning. And if you're trying to really make a pluralistic society and really trying to get a marketplace of ideas, you have to empower some people to speak. You have to allow them to speak, and you have to stop people who are purposely trying to close those people down. Speech is not always free. It's never free, because it has meaning and it has implications. And so we have laws in the US that say you cannot yell the word fire in a crowded theater, because everyone runs and they stampede and they hurt each other. So there are laws. We have implemented laws in the past on airwaves. Father Coughlin was a priest who was anti-immigrant and he was anti-Semitic. And finally, the Roosevelt administration closed him down, stopped him from broadcasting because of his hate speech, and also opposition to the war too, and opposition to the FDR. But we have licensing laws in the US. The airwaves are licensed by the government, but they have just allowed this to go on. And it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. Institutions, the state has power, and institutions have power. They have it. That's just how they are built. And they can use it legitimately and good for democracy and not. And allowing this mythology of the marketplace of ideas and allow hate speech to take place and allow misinformation to take place is not allowing democracy. It's undermining it. So what I'm saying is controversial because many people will have opposition to it. But I think it needs to be discussed. It's already in law. You already had it with the licensing of network broadcasting. It just hasn't been used. It's been used, it has actually been subverted for the reason of anti-democracy. So that's my view.
Thank you, Professor. We have the last question of Elizabeth Artman. Poderia botar, por favor, aí na tela? I will read it for you, okay? In times of internet, with the new generation been connecting all the day, the way of interaction is changing. How do you see tradition supported by values such as solidarity and empathy today?
Well, this is a difficult question. Some of the ways the new, as it were, new generation, every generation is new for me at this point, particularly. The new generations connect all the time is not always in terms of solidarity and empathy. In fact, not. They can be extremely mean. Extremely mean. And the type of interactions that people have, I mean, younger people can be mean anyway, even more, but my question is linked to the production of practical knowledge. Well, yes, maybe I'm answering that, I don't know. The writing as we are seeing it on the internet now, Maurizio Ferraris, a philosopher in Italy, in documentation, says wisely, we're writing all the time and we're reading all the time. And I'm not sure this has produced more emotive sympathy. In fact, maybe even less. The short fragments, the short type of texting doesn't allow a full explication of person's ideas. It doesn't allow, it's not really a conversation. You can't see the other person. You can't, not always, you can't interject. It's not a conversation. In terms of discourse, you're not dealing with knowledge text. You're not talking about knowledge products. It can result in unopinionated and nasty exchanges. The new technologies are not really advanced in terms of empathy and even solidarity. They can be, especially solidarity as constructed along a large party state. That's an interesting question, how it actually can solidify and strengthen party politics. I mean, that's what we've seen with Trump. And in other forms too, in the left too. But you know, that makes us think. As I said, these type of systems can allow the most extreme statements and solidarity around the most extreme statements. And that's actually a warning sign. So I think there's problems what we have to think is different problematics involving the rhetorical form, right? These short little chunks, the imitation of speech when they're not imitations of speech, the problems of writing as a monologic or monovocal mechanism, in other words, like statement forms. There's a lot of rhetorical problems of writing that we're now seeing come become apparent in a way that we weren't aware of before. And then these new rhetorical forms, how they take place, and what type of truth claims they lead to, and what type of truth claims they don't lead to, and the prejudice they lead us to. On the other hand, the instantaneousness of communication, the ability of me to talk to you and you to talk to me to some extent, worldwide, is just extraordinary. I mean, it's nothing like what I grew up in. It's just a completely different world. And that is certainly a very positive thing. It's a very positive thing to have social movements. It's a very positive thing to have, for me, to have internationalism and globalism. Modernity in those terms are very good things. We have to have. So there's positives and negatives to these technologies and the rhetorical forms, and how they inflect in cultural space and social norms and governmental spaces. So, I've been very critical of the internet here, but believe me, I wouldn't want to live without it. But we all live in whatever technological events we live in, there's positive and negative affordances they offer. And so our job is to critically think them through and to then discuss them. And, what I'm telling you here is not truth, of course. It's an exploration of concepts, which I invite you to explore and challenge and say they're not good. And it's just an element of a conversation. That's what we have here, I hope. And I appreciate you having spent time listening to me. I couldn't have done it in a tweet. I'm not as talented as Donald Trump is in this. So, thank you.
Gostaria de agradecer a todos os participantes. Foi uma tarde muito rica. Gostaria de mais uma vez lembrar que a mesa das 14 horas está mantida. Então, peço para que hoje, sendo o nosso último dia, se esforcem para que nessa volta vocês já consigam estar conosco. Professor, thank you very much. It was a really grateful day. A lot of comments on YouTube. Then I send you the link for you can see it. A lot of warnings and people thanking for the presentation.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, and I really hope you all stay safe in the midst of the virus and the reign of terror that you have to experience in Brazil, politically and medically, and that we share with you here. Let's hope we all get through this, and as they say in English, bless you. Take care of yourselves and be well. Thank you all for spending the time here with me. And Asy, thank you very much for mediating. And thank you, who is it, Ricardo, for the technical work. Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be with you. And take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Boa tarde a todos.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Então, só convidando a todos mais uma vez, lembrando o convite do Asy, às 14 horas, então a gente vai ter 35 minutos aí de intervalo para o almoço. A mesa redonda, na verdade seria uma comunicação, das notas introdutórias de uma teoria crítica discursiva da informação, no grupo de trabalho professor Clóvis, com Márcio Gonçalves e Mariângela Rebelo. Também teremos o colapso da esfera pública e a ecologia política das redes, do Guilherme de Figueiredo Prégia, da UERJ, em sequência das condições de validação ou não da comunicação na era da desinformação, da Luciana de Souza Gracioso, e o último trabalho da sessão das 14, Fake News, Hiperinformação, Desinformação, Fetichismo e Pandemia na web, da professora Márcia Tavares, que já tinha comunicado aqui no chat, Então, tenham todos um bom almoço, e daqui a pouquinho estamos de volta aí com as atividades do último dia do 16º Colóquio Habermas e o 7º Colóquio de Filosofia da Informação. Até breve.